Nope, nope, nope.
Oh,
I didn't want to do that.
no,
Sorry.
no. Okay.
Record button. And just welcome as people are starting to come into the waiting room. And welcome to this edition of Chebacco Chats. We are in season 4, episode 11. And I just want to make sure if somebody from the attendees can just let me know through the chat feature that you can hear us okay. I had a little bit of an issue earlier with Zoom. So if somebody from the participants would let us know really quick in the chat or the question and answer that you can hear us okay, I'd really appreciate it. Okay, great. We can hear. I just had a moment of nervousness that Zoom was doing funny things because we had a little blip with Earle. So forgive me for that, but thank you. I'm glad you guys could join us. So I'm Raney Bench. I'm the executive director here at the MDI Historical Society and your host for this edition of Chebacco Chats. We are in season 4 of this series, and this is episode 11. And I'm joined tonight by Earle Shettleworth. But before we get started, I want to start our evening by acknowledging the devastating mass shooting that took place in Lewiston last night. This is the worst in Maine's history and the deadliest in the United States this year. So I would like to ask that we take a moment of silence to reflect on this tragic event and all of the senseless killings that we are forced to endure all too often. Maine is a place of great natural beauty, and as such, it provides spaces for us to reflect and to find peace within our souls. There's no graceful way for me to transition into our conversation today, but it's my hope that by choosing to spend some time here learning about how Maine's stunning landscape has inspired and comforted others in the past, that we can provide a small glimmer of light for you in this dark day. So thank you for doing that together. Just so you know, Chebacco Chats is a webinar format. So if you want to ask any questions or send any comments, please do so through the chat or the question and answer features. And I'll be able to look at those and see them, and we'll answer questions towards the end of our time together today. We also record all of our Chebacco chats, and they are available usually about a week after the fact through our website. Today, we're chatting with Maine State Historian Earle Shettleworth about his article in the 2023 edition of Chebacco, Painting That Mountainous and Sea-Girt Isle, Harrison Bird Brown on Mount Desert Island. Earle is a native of Portland, Maine, and he studied at Colby College and Boston University. He's received honorary degrees from Bowdoin College and Maine College of Art. He became an architectural historian for the Maine Historic Preservation Commission in 1973, and then its director soon after in 1976. He's retired from that position in 2015, but he continues to be active in the state, writing, lecturing, both on art and on architecture. So Earle, thank you very much for being with us this afternoon and for your contribution to our beautiful edition of Chebacco this year. So I'm going to get started by sharing my screen. And so Earle, who is Harrison Bird Brown, and how is it that he became a painter?
Well, Harrison Brown was born in Portland in 1831. We're seeing him here in this wonderful drawing that was done of him in 1859 when he was just starting his career as a major landscape painter. So I say he was born in Portland in 1831. He lost his father at the age of 15, forcing him to leave his education and go to the workplace. And he had already shown artistic talent, so he apprenticed with a prominent firm in Portland that did house and ship painting. And when he completed that apprenticeship about 1850, he started his own business as a banner, sign, and ornamental painter. During the 1850s, he gradually gain strength in his chosen field. He really morphed from going to the practical art of painting, like sign painting, into landscape painting and marine painting. And so as a result, by 1857, he had developed enough work to be able to do his first exhibit of landscape and marine paintings in Portland in 1857.
Great, thank you. And I had a question about closed captioning. I will look and see if I can enable closed captioning on this as we go. So thank you for that question. So continuing on with Bird, what were his connections to MDI?
Well, when he first started his career as a landscape and marine painter in the late 1850s, one of the first journeys that he took that we have a record of was a journey up the coast in the summer of 1858, along with another young painter from the Boston area named Aaron Draper Shattuck. And they are recorded as having visited Monhegan Island in June of 1858. And then there's a record that Shattuck went on to Mount Desert that summer. It's thought that Brown might very well have accompanied him, because we find that they're painting together again in the fall in the White Mountains. Certainly by the early 1860s, we have much evidence that Brown is a frequent visitor to Mount Desert. There are a number of major paintings of his that appear in exhibitions, both in Portland, Boston, New York, with Mount Desert titles.
Nice. You mentioned a little bit about who he was painting with. Who else were his peers during this period of time as he's starting to get his, oh, we have just another example of his work here.
Sure. Of course, to just give a little bit of background, I think many of us who are familiar with the art history of Mount Desert, which is such a rich topic, we find that major Hudson River School painters such as Thomas Cole and Frederick Church come here in the 1840s and 50s. But at the same time, other important Hudson River School artists like Kensett and Gifford are also coming to the island to do work. In fact, there's that incredible painting of Sanford Gifford, almost like a self-portrait, sitting on the top of what is now Cadillac Mountain, looking down. There it is, looking down to the whole spread of Mount Desert below, and Otter Creek in particular in the center. And so it's in this setting that Brown is really the major Maine painter that we know of this period, beginning in the late 1850s and continuing in the 1860s, 70s, and into the 1880s. He's the one major local painter, so to speak, Maine painter, who makes regular visits to Mount Desert. But his compatriots from Boston, New York, Philadelphia, in the Northeast are also very much a part of this development of second half of the 19th century art of Mount Desert.
Sort of, did he have any direct relationships? Were they traveling together, working together, inspired by one another? Do you have any sort of sense of?
Well, I think beyond that early reference that I mentioned with his friendship with Aaron Draper Shattuck, we don't seem to have any specific references. It's very interesting. One of his fairly early works that's shown in New York, I think it's shown in New York around 1859 or 60, of Mount Desert, references that it may very well have been based upon a work by Kensett. But as to knowing for sure who else he knew in relation to Mount Desert, we just don't have records of it.
Interesting. And unfortunate, so that we don't get to know. So these are landscape painters. They're out in the natural environment and being inspired by what we see here in Maine. but Brown was not a plein air painter. So can you talk a little bit about his
Yeah,
technique?
no, this is one of the interesting things that we learn about Brown. We learn about it in two ways. One, Brown was a major cultural figure in Portland from the 1850s until he retired and left Portland for London, England in the 1890s. And during this period, several decades, the newspapers in Portland report on an almost weekly basis about his activities. And I've been able to go through those old newspapers, particularly the Portland Daily Press and the Portland Transcript, and find almost like a journal or a diary of his activities and his travels and his practices. And what we find is that usually in the spring through the fall, he would travel to very focused places. He would go up the coast to Mount Desert and maybe continue on to the Maritimes, particularly to Grand Manan. He liked Grand Manan very much across from Eastport. Or he would go specifically to the White Mountains, so on. And inevitably, the accounts published about him and his travels indicate that he's there sketching, and that then he brings his sketchbooks back and then develops paintings from late fall to early spring during the sort of winter months of the year. And this is borne out by the fact that the Portland Museum of Art owns 9 of his sketchbooks. And
Mm.
here we have a page opened up which shows us a cliff scene off Mount Desert on the right, and then it's there's a little sort of sketch looking out, maybe out to the Porcupines and Bar Harbor, with a little rock in the foreground, and this is very typical of the way he operated. He was very intent on sketches when he traveled in Europe in the early 1870s, filled his sketchbooks with information on Europe. And sometimes it would be several years before he'd go back to a sketch and develop it into a painting.
Hmm. Now, I'm curious, was it unusual for the newspapers to sort of follow someone as closely as you're saying they talked about all of his techniques and where he was and what he was doing? Was that common, or was that sort of
Well,
unusual
you know,
focus on birds?
fortunately for us, where some of these painters did not leave a group of personal papers or a diary or a journal, um, it's really quite remarkable. I mean, I've been doing newspaper research, particularly on the Portland painters, but on other painters in Maine as well. And I find that these 19th century newspapers were very interested in the comings and goings of their artists within their communities. And so oftentimes one can find a great deal of information about an individual. Oftentimes it is the major source of information about a particular individual. I mean, for example, there's a wonderful painter of the late 19th, early 20th century who was from Monson, Seth Stewart. Now, there are no Seth Stewart papers or diaries or letters, but the local newspapers in Monmouth and in Dover Foxcroft and that area of Maine, they wrote often about what he was doing. So we learn about him that way.
Oh, that's so interesting. I had no idea about that. Um, so he's taking these sketches from the landscape, visiting here in person, and he's going back to his studio and painting them there. And generally, who were his clientele?
Well, his clientele were a mixture of middle and upper class individuals. They were, in most cases, people in the greater Portland area. What we have to remember about Portland is that by the mid 19th century, it was a thriving seaport. It was the largest seaport in Maine. It had these wonderful economic connections through the railroad to Canada, particularly Montreal. There were steamships going every week between Portland and England, Liverpool. So there was a lot of commercial success in Portland, just as Brown's career was getting going in the 1850s. And this continued right on through the balance of his career into the 1890s. So he had a lot of local clientele, but he also was very active in showing his work in Boston, New York, and elsewhere. And so he attracted out-of-state clients. And then in the post-Civil War period, Portland, like Mount Desert, became an important tourist destination. And consequently, he had a whole new market of tourists who were coming to Portland, visiting his studio, or seeing his work shown in shops, usually framing shops, and buying from him in that level. Now, in particular, he had a very strong clientele from very successful businessmen in Maine in the second half of the 19th century. And we get into this a little bit later in an example of Captain Ignatius Stevens, where they would specifically commission works that commemorated an aspect of their lives.
Well, that is a good transition to these two paintings here. What do you
Yes.
want to talk about
Well,
next?
of course, we know from both surviving paintings and also from, in addition, from the various references in newspapers and in exhibits, that he did quite a few paintings of Mount Desert from the 1850s to the 1890s. However, I think of all the work that we know of that has survived, that we have evidence of, these two paintings are by far the most remarkable. The one in the upper left, view of Hulls Cove, 1862-63, owned by the Hulls Cove Neighborhood Association and on long-term loan to the Bar Harbor Historical Society, is the first of these two paintings. And from the research that Willie Granston and I did in preparation for my article, we find that it was commissioned by Captain Joseph Ignatius Stevens. He was born in Hulls Cove in 1812. His father was a shipbuilder, a ship owner, and a sea captain. He and his father lived in Hulls Cove until about the time of the death of his mother, Eunice. There was a remarriage, and then the family moved to Portland. And so continued in the maritime activity, Joseph Ignatius Stevens, like his father, became a highly successful sea captain. So time goes by, has his whole career out of the port of Portland. But in 1862, he decides to return to Mount Desert after an absence of approximately 40 years. And he returns to Hulls Cove to place a gravestone on his mother's grave. And at that time, I think he's struck by the beauty of the location, the nostalgia of not having been there for so many years. And he commissions Brown to create this beautiful painting of what was the place of his birth and the place of the first 10 years of his life. And so we get Hulls Cove at the right, and then we get the distant view of Bar Harbor, and of course the great mountains of Mount Desert. From my understanding, it's really one of Brown's finest topographic views. There's an immense amount of detail in it, houses, buildings, topography. It's really a very important record of Hulls Cove and Mount Desert at the time of the Civil War. Well, as though this isn't enough, Captain Stevens recognizes that in his little native village of Hulls Cove, there's a great need for a modern schoolhouse. And so he very generously, in 1863, gives the community $700 to build a schoolhouse, and it's up by 1864. And then he commissions Brown to do a second painting commemorating the fact that the schoolhouse has been built. And so that's the second painting in the lower right-hand corner. And this is a private collection of the Butlers, who very generously shared this with us. And if you look at the lower right-hand corner of the upper picture, you will not see, because it's a little different vantage point, the hip-roof white house that's just a couple buildings in from the right, in the lower right-hand corner. But when the second painting is done by Brown for Stevens in 1864, that house now appears, because of the angle of the painting, we're a little bit further back. That is the Stevens homestead. That's where the captain grew up. And then at the right is the schoolhouse that he built for the community. This is really part of a larger part of Harrison Brown's work, in that these wealthy, successful men of the mid to late 19th century in Maine, in a number of cases, commissioned him to do these celebratory pictures of their early homesteads, where they were born, where they grew up, kind of a celebration of their success, how they went from rags to riches.
If anyone is interested in seeing the view of Hull's Cove from 1862, 1863, that is on display at the Bar Harbor Historical Society, they are free and open to the public on Saturday, October 28th, from 10 to 2. So you could have a chance to go and see that painting and study it in more detail in person at their La Rochelle location in downtown Bar Harbor. So we know that he was very active on Mount Desert Island, and that he was painting also more broadly in Maine. What other places did he find inspiration, and where else was he painting?
Well, he's very much a painter of his time, mid to late 19th century. And if you were in New England in that period, the White Mountains beckoned. Now, the White Mountains were first discovered by painters like Thomas Cole way back in the 1820s and 30s, and more locally, painters such as Charles Codman of Portland. And so the White Mountains were another major focus of Brown's work. And we're looking here at a really fascinating painting. This is the trestle at Crawford Notch, done probably around 1890. And originally, this was a painting, a large, grand painting, commissioned by the Maine Central Railroad to advertise the fact that there was a line through the highly scenic White Mountains. We do not know where the original painting is. We don't know whether it survived or not, but it does survive in this beautiful gravure print, which does capture the painterly quality of this great painting. And this was a painting that was multiplied many times through this advertising print. And these advertising prints were then hung in hotels, steamship offices, railroad offices, and stations to advertise the Maine Central's line through the White Mountains. And this is just one example of many very dramatic paintings that Brown and his compatriots of that period did of the White Mountains. Now, in addition to that, he loved to travel. And in the early 1870s, he took a long trip to Europe, England, France, Italy, in particular, and there are a number of paintings that he worked up from sketches after those travels.
And you tell of additional paintings that were advertisements similar to this one, specific to
Yes.
Maine, that are missing also.
Oh, yes. Well, the wonderful thing about historical research is that when you least expect it, what you've been looking for years turns up. And so we can still hope. Now, there were two of these advertising prints based upon Harrison Brown paintings of the White Mountains that were commissioned by the Maine Central Railroad. The other is of the Frankenstein trestle in the White Mountains. Neither of those paintings have come up, but we at least have the print representations of them. We also know through the old newspaper accounts that in the 1880s, when the Maine Central Railroad opened its line to Mount Desert Ferry, and then, of course, the travelers would go there to Hancock, and then go from there over to Mount Desert by ferry, that the railroad commemorated this by doing two major paintings of Mount Desert by Harrison Brown. And we know that the paintings themselves were exhibited in Boston and other places to promote this new railroad connection to Mount Desert. In fact, in the period when President Harrison was being inaugurated in March of 1889 in Washington, D.C., the paintings were on display in a downtown store window in Washington, D.C. We'd love to know where they are now. We have, unfortunately, they were not turned into advertising prints like the White Mountain paintings were. So we don't have representations of them. And they haven't shown up in any old photographs yet as well. But they're out there somewhere. And the wonderful thing about research too is that you know, you have to have some holy grails to keep looking for. If we knew it all, our you know, our journey would be very dull.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. Something for the next generation of historians as well.
Well, hopefully,
Yeah.
maybe even us.
Yeah. So we're sort of coming to the close. These half hours go really fast, but before I ask our last question, I would just invite those of us in the audience who are participating, you're welcome to please post questions or comments or observations into the chat or the question and answer feature for Earle today about Harrison Bird Brown and his work in Maine. And you know, as we wait to see if people have some curiosity that they would love to share or questions that they want answered, my last question to you today would be, you know, sort of what do you think Brown's legacy is, and why does he continue to play a role in how we understand the artistic landscape and history of Maine?
Well, I think I would place Harrison Brown as probably one of the most important Maine artists of the period from 1850 to 1890. In that, while he traveled extensively, as we've talked about, and painted many different subjects in different areas, he always rooted himself in Portland, where he was born. In fact, he was so successful at a relatively early age that in 1861, he built a beautiful house on the edge of the Western Promenade area in Portland that still stands today. And then in the 1870s, he moved his studio there as well. I think what I would say about Brown is that he is, in terms of native landscape painters born in Maine in the 19th century, who stayed in Maine, worked in Maine, he is probably one of the most significant artists in that group. He certainly committed his life and his career to primarily focusing on the Maine landscape and the Maine seascape.
Great. Thank you. Well, we haven't had any questions coming in because you're so thorough, and your article is also very thorough, I would assume. So any last kind of thoughts about your research and talking about him, or just the process of writing the article for Chebacco? Did you have any new discoveries or things that that were exciting to
Yeah, no, I was very grateful to be asked to do the article, in that it's interesting when you study the published histories, and there've been three very fine ones in particular of the art of Mount Desert. There's very little reference to Brown. So in a sense, when Willie Granston approached me about doing this article, I felt that there was an area of contribution that I could make, that I could really fill in a gap, and that I had the opportunity, having done extensive newspaper research on him, and being able to fall back on that research and go through it line by line, article by article. I could reconstruct an outline of what his career was in relation to Mount Desert from the 1850s to the early 1890s. And so I really welcomed this opportunity. And then when I saw the finished product published, I was particularly gratified to be part of it, because I think that your current issue is really a truly handsome publication.
Oh, thank you. Yes, it's been a great publication. We don't normally go quite so narrow of a focus with just maritime, but it's such an expansive topic that we can go from shipbuilding to painting, in one edition, which is pretty remarkable. And I'm super grateful to Willie Granston for really helping with the breadth of the different articles and the scope of the edition itself. Well, thank you so much, Earle. We didn't have any questions come up, but I'm really grateful. And I just will mention that we have Chebacco Chats as an ongoing series, which airs live on Thursdays at 4:30. So next week on November 2nd at 4:30, we are not working with a Chebacco author, but we will be talking with Master Gardener Joy Lyons, who has been responsible in transforming the heirloom gardens on the Soamesville campus, which are among the most photographed places in the state of Maine, where we have that iconic footbridge that's part of our logo. So hopefully people will be able to join us next week. As I mentioned, these are all recorded, and so this will be available to view on our website. We'll send a link out to the recording next week, and it will also be available through our YouTube channel. So you can subscribe to our YouTube channel at mdihistory.org to be notified when anything new is uploaded. And we encourage you, if you're not already, to become a membership or renew your membership by visiting our website, mdihistory.org. So thank you all so much for attending this afternoon. And thank you, Earle, for your time and your expertise and your perspective. I'm really grateful for that. Thank you. Oh, wait, we had something in the chat. Thank you. Very informative. Perfect. Thank you all. Take care.